Hello, this is Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we're going to build a big mound of dirt and bury a couple of small structures underneath. Doesn't that sound fun? In all seriousness, we're going to do that, but we're also going to talk about the royal tombs of Macedon at Vergina, which is ancient Agae, the capital of ancient Macedonia, and talk about the burial of Philip II, king of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. Now, I suspect everyone might know a bit about Alexander the Great, or at least have heard his name before, but in case not, he was formerly King Alexander III of Macedon and lived from July 365 BC through June of 323 BC, and is famous for uniting all of Greece under his rule and then turning towards the east and conquering the whole of the Persian Empire and creating one of the largest empires in world history by the time he was 30 years old and died at the young age of 32. However, all that said, if it weren't for Alexander the Great's father, Philip II, it's quite possible that none of that would have occurred. This is because it was Philip who reformed and built the army that Alexander used. Alexander's generals were Philip's generals, and Philip who set the stage and plans in motion to unite Greece and conquer or at least invade Persia. Alexander picked up those plans after Philip's assassination and did the work of implementing them. So, whether Philip would have been as successful as Alexander in those endeavors, there's no way to know. So who was Philip II? Philip was born in 383 or 382 BC in Macedon and was the youngest son to the king of Macedon, and his elevation to the kingship wasn't straightforward. Rather, it was one full of murder, assassination, and usurpation. He even spent time as a hostage both in Illyria, a neighboring kingdom to Macedon, as well as the Greek city-state of Thebes, the leading city of Greece at the time, where he possibly learned the military tactics and got the inspiration that he used to revolutionize the Macedonian military. I'm not going to go blow by blow through all of Philip II's life, but needless to say, the Macedonian succession was a wildly twisting and confused affair, and this is made even more complex by the Macedonian practice of polygamy, where the ruler would often have multiple wives in order to secure various political alliances, both within Macedon and its neighbors. Philip had 7 wives over his reign, and I mention this because this fact, as well as the confused nature of Macedonian politics and succession, are important to understand in discussing the tombs in the Great Tumulus, and who might be buried there, and understand the archaeological site. Well, and also, who doesn't find a royal family full of murder, assassinations, and backstabbing interesting? Jumping forward in time, Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC at a marriage ceremony between Alexander I of Epirus, a neighboring kingdom to the west, and Cleopatra of Macedon, who was the daughter of Olympias, Philip's 4th wife and also the mother of Alexander the Great. Cleopatra is a very common name, so this has no relation to the famous Cleopatra, who was the last pharaoh of Egypt and also famously involved with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. In both ancient and modern times, much ink has been spilled around the motivations behind the assassination and who ordered and plotted to have it carried out. Some pointed to Alexander the Great and his mother Olympias as the ones behind it in order to secure the throne for Alexander after Philip and his 7th wife, also named Cleopatra, had a baby, thus complicating the succession lines. Others have pointed to other individuals and motivations within the Macedonian royal court, and others pointed to more personal offenses from the bodyguard of Philip named Pausanias, who did the actual killing. So with all that background out of the way, let's talk about the actual archaeological site where Philip is buried. The consensus is that Philip II is buried at the Great Tumulus of Vergina. A tumulus is a large mound of earth, otherwise known as a burial mound or a barrow, that lays over top of a tomb and acts as the tomb's grave marker. There are 3 tombs that we'll talk about in depth in this episode that lays within the Great Tumulus, though a 4th tomb has been found subsequent to the original excavations. Tomb 1 is a large kiss tomb. Kiss tombs range in size from being a small stone box just large enough to hold a burial urn or other small grave goods to, in this case, being larger. Tomb 1 in the Great Tumulus was 3.5 meters by 2 meters by 3 meters tall. So that's around 11.5 by 6.5 feet by about 10 feet tall. It also had no door, so the only way to access it was through a slab that was removable in the roof, which is where grave robbers, unfortunately, were able to break in antiquity. Despite taking all of what they saw as loot and valuable, they left the bones of 3 individuals contained and scattered around the tomb. Those individuals were a male around middle age, a female that was much younger, around 18 to 20, and then an infant, perhaps a couple of months old. That tomb also had a picture on the wall of Hades abducting Persephone. Tomb 2 is a barrel-vaulted tomb, meaning the ceiling is in the shape of an arch, kind of like a barrel, overhead. This tomb was not looted in antiquity, and so was preserved with all of its artifacts and remains. In this tomb there was a central door, so no need to have to enter through the roof, and over that door was a painting of a hunting frieze. That tomb contained an antechamber and another doorway at the far end that led to another chamber. It's been theorized that this main chamber was built hastily because instead of the walls containing paintings or decorations, it just contains the preliminary coat of stucco. The antechamber, which is larger than normal, typically would only contain grave goods, but in this case also contains a burial. The main chamber was around 6 meters by 5 meters, or around 20 by 16 feet, and the antechamber was around 5 by 5 meters, or around 16 by 16. I'll go into those burial goods and the burials themselves found in the main chamber and the antechamber in a bit, but for now, let's move on to the last of the 3 tombs. Like Tomb 2, Tomb 3 was also not looted by grave robbers and was a barrel-vaulted tomb, and then also contained a main chamber and an antechamber, both of which were smaller than those in Tomb 2, with the main chamber being around 5 meters by 5 meters, or 16 by 16 feet, and the antechamber being around 3 meters by 5 meters, or 10 feet by 16 feet. Also similar to Tomb 2, Tomb 3 had a central door for an entrance, but the painting above the door, while present at one time, has been lost and has decayed to the extent that it can no longer be seen. Okay, with the Great Tumulus and its 3 tombs now complete, let's do a little tour of each one, and we could talk about who archaeologists think is buried in each and why. Oh, and spoiler alert, archaeologists aren't in complete agreement, and so I'll also walk you through the different theories and why there's a difference of opinion around the scholarly community. Starting first with Tomb 3, this tomb, based on the grave goods found within it, dates to around the end of the 4th century BC. It contains the remain of one cremated individual, and based on its teeth and other skeletal markers, showed to be a male between the ages of 13 and 15 years of age. Based on the dating of the tomb and matching that with historical records and literary descriptions for the royal family at the time, means that this tomb is consistent with the tomb of Alexander IV, son of Alexander the Great. After Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC, his generals divided and warred over his fragmented empire. His son Alexander IV was executed in 310 BC by Cassander, one of Alexander's generals who was ruling over Macedonia. Moving away from Tomb 3 and over to Tomb 2, this is where things start getting a bit interesting. The original excavator, who was named Andronikos, came to the conclusion and made the argument that it was Tomb 2 that was the tomb for Philip II. So let's go in and check it out. As I stated earlier, Tomb 2 is the largest of the 3 tombs and contained the remains of a male and a young female, and different scholars have theories around the identities of both of those individuals. Starting first in the main chamber, this contained the remains of a male, which were located in a golden chest, which contained the starburst emblem of the Macedonian royal family on the top of the chest. Beyond the cremated remains of the male individual, who was middle-aged and whose bones and skeleton were quite intact, there was also a golden wreath, like a golden crown. In the antechamber, there was also a golden chest, which contained the cremated remains of a female in her 20s. This skeleton was cremated for longer and on account was less intact. There were also a couple of pieces of armor. There was a chest piece with golden decorations and an iron helmet, as well as a golden and ivory ceremonial shield. There was also a reference to a 2-meter long pole that some have called a scepter, but that subsequently disappeared or disintegrated. Also located by the door between the 2 rooms was a golden bow case and a pair of greaves. What's interesting about these greaves is that they were different sizes. The one leg was 3.5 centimeters, or around 1.5 inches shorter on the one leg than on the other. These greaves can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. The scholars who argue against the remains in the chamber being Philip II have argued that the armor might very well have been that of Alexander the Great, When Alexander died in Babylon, his body and his armor were transported back to his home. However, one of his generals named Ptolemy captured his body and brought it back to his successor kingdom in Egypt, where he built a shrine and buried the body in Alexandria. The armor continued its way to Macedon. If that armor is from Alexander the Great, that means that tomb 2 likely isn't to be from Philip, because the armor would date from after his burial. Those scholars also point out that the hunting frieze and the fact that tomb 2 is a barrel vaulted tomb also point to dating the tomb to after Alexander's reign. They argue that the lions in the frieze wouldn't have existed at that time in Macedon. So basically, the tomb 2 would need to date after Alexander the Great's reign in order to incorporate the influx of Persian influences, because it was only after Alexander conquered Persia that those influences were introduced into Macedon. If those scholars are correct and it isn't Philip in tomb 2, then who's buried there and where's Philip buried? Those scholars point to Alexander's stepbrother and his wife as the likely individuals for who's in tomb 2. They were killed by Cassander in 316 BC, that same general I mentioned earlier who killed Alexander IV. As for where they think Philip II is, they point to the occupant of tomb 1. So let's head over to tomb 1, and as I mentioned, it's a little bit different than the two tombs we just looked at, as it's a kiss tomb. The scholars who are of the opinion that tomb 1 is the resting place of Philip say that being buried in a kiss tomb would be more in line with the burial practices at the time of Philip's death. They also point out that a few months after Philip was assassinated, Philip II's wife, who was the mother of Alexander the Great, had Philip II's newest wife, Cleopatra, and their infant son killed, and Cleopatra's age matches with the age of one of the skeletons found in tomb 1. The middle-aged body of the male matches that of Philip, as does the skeleton of an infant, so that story seems to check out. Philip was also known to have been injured a number of times in battle with his various campaigns, including a nasty spear wound to his leg that was so bad it killed the horse he was riding on and left him lame. Also, in a different campaign, he took a wound to the face, specifically his eye, and the male skeleton in tomb 1 had a puncture wound in his right knee, so it seems to match that of Philip. So that's one way scholars have looked at this, but that isn't how the original excavating archaeologist interpreted it, as I said, and recently in the past few years, the site's been reanalyzed. Most scholars now seem to be in agreement with that original archaeologist's conclusion, where Philip II is in tomb 2, not in tomb 1, and here's why. Recently, scholarship has pointed out that prior to Alexander the Great's invasion and overthrow of the Persian Empire, there was already substantial contact and familiarity between Macedon and Persian cultures. Likewise, a more detailed analysis of hunting friezes in Macedonian burials show numerous examples of similar themes, and so there too they would argue that it's incorrect to draw such a linear interpretation of seeing a hunting frieze and assuming Persian influence. To further back up Philip being the male remains in the main chamber of tomb 2, they point out that ancient sources describe Philip's leg wound differently. They don't mention which leg was injured, and one source talks about it being on his thigh, where another one talks about it being on his lower leg. All sources do agree, though, that the wound was severe and left him lame after he recovered. The other evidence for Philip being the individual in tomb 2 is from the individual's skull, which shows damage to the right eye, so appears to match historical accounts of Philip's facial wound. Some of those scholars also make the case for the female buried in the antechamber of tomb 2 being Philip's wife, called Medea. Medea was the daughter of a Scythian king, and as such, was familiar with archery and horsemanship. The vertebra on the female found in tomb 2 had wear consistent with someone who'd spent a life in the saddle, and recall the golden quiver in the tomb found along with the armor. And speaking of that armor, recall that the greaves found in the tomb had one leg that was shorter than the other. Medea, according to sources, is said to have had a fall off a horse and damaged her leg. Modern analysis of the descriptions of those ancient sources say that a fall and the leg fracture described would have caused the type of damage that would have stunted the growth in only that one leg, and so it was likely shorter than the other, which seems to fit the greaves. Medea also reportedly took her own life upon the death of her husband Philip being assassinated, sacrificing herself according to the Scythian customs, so it might make sense that she would then be buried with him. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry to have not put a nice neat bow on all this, but I wanted to present both sides, as I think from what I've read, there's compelling reasons to believe that Philip Philip and his wife and newborn are buried in tomb 1, but then also compelling reasons to think that Philip and his wife Meta are buried in tomb 2. Either way, I think the only solid consensus is that Alexander IV, son of Alexander the Great, is buried in tomb 3, while Philip is probably buried in either tomb 1 or tomb 2. I dropped a bunch of links to resources I used to research this episode and would encourage you to check those out if you want to learn more. Make sure to take the time to like the video if you liked it and subscribe and all that stuff. And if you want more videos from my channel, please check those out too. Thanks. Have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.